The snow lay thick upon the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, and the village hummed with the quiet merriment of Christmas. Fires glowed warmly behind curtained windows, and the air carried the mingled scents of pine, cinnamon, and rich winter fare. Miss Jane Marple, ever observant and quietly content, had been invited to spend the holiday luncheon at Greystone Manor. The grand estate of Colonel and Mrs. Harwood. The highlight of the occasion promised to be Mrs. Harwood's famed plum pudding, a recipe so carefully guarded it was spoken of in reverent tones. The drawing-room was bright with holly and laughter, though beneath the gaiety, Miss Marple's discerning eye detected subtle tensions and anxious glance here, a sharp remark there, the faint strain of politeness worn thin. It was in such seemingly festive settings that the darkest truths often revealed themselves, and Miss Marple knew that Christmas could bring more than cheer. Chapter 1. A festive gathering. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the December sun casting long pale beams across the frosted hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped snugly in a grey woolen shawl, paused by her window to survey the garden. Sparrows hopped briskly among the bare rose bushes, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed 9. It was Christmas morning, and though age and solitude had slowed her step, Miss Marple felt a quiet pleasure in the day's promise. An invitation had arrived a fortnight earlier from Colonel and Mrs. Harwood of Greystone Manor. The Harwoods were newcomers to the district, wealthy and sociable, intent on impressing their neighbours with hospitality. Mrs. Harwood in particular was determined to establish herself as a hostess of refinement, and what better occasion than a grand Christmas luncheon? Their reputation for extravagance had already set the village abuzz, and whispers of a famous plum pudding prepared according to an old family recipe had stirred considerable curiosity. Miss Marple had accepted at once, partly out of politeness, partly out of genuine interest. She had seen enough of village life to know that in festive gatherings, beneath laughter and ribbons, one often glimpsed the raw edge of human character. Christmas, with its forced cheer and enforced company, brought both warmth and strain, and Miss Marple, who preferred knitting in her cosy parlour, had a keen sense for such undercurrents. By midday, she was driven to the manor in the Harwoods' shining motor car, the frosted countryside flying past like a watercolour in silver and white. Greystone Manor stood at the end of a sweeping gravel drive, its gables decked with holly and a wreath upon the oak front door. Inside, the house glowed with warmth. A towering Christmas tree, hung with candles and glittering glass baubles, dominated the hall. Servants in crisp uniforms moved swiftly, taking coats and offering glasses of sherry. Miss Marple, how delightful of you to come. Mrs. Harwood, tall, elegant, and faintly severe, swept forward in a gown of deep burgundy velvet. We have gathered the very best of the neighbourhood. Do let me introduce you. The guests were indeed a curious mix. There was Dr. Pritchard, the village physician, jovial yet faintly pompous. His wife fluttered nervously at his side, ever anxious to please. Young Lydia Harwood, the Colonel's niece, lingered near the fire with her suitor, a dark-haired solicitor named Edwin Price. The pair exchanged whispers with the restless intensity of youth. Across the room, Major Talbot retired, red-faced, and fond of port boomed anecdotes to anyone within earshot. And in the corner, almost withdrawn, sat Mrs. Finch, a widow of uncertain means, her eyes darting about as though fearful of being noticed. Colonel Harwood, genial and loud-voiced, clapped his hands for attention. My friends, welcome. We are honoured to have you at Greystone this Christmas. May it be the first of many. He beamed at his wife, who inclined her head with regal satisfaction. The party soon moved into the dining hall, a magnificent room where garlands of ivy framed tall windows. A long table groaned beneath silver and crystal, each place set with precise care. Miss Marple, seated between Dr. Pritchard and young Lydia, observed the company with her customary serenity. The conversation was lively, though she noted with interest the occasional sharpness beneath the pleasantries. Mrs. Harwood's smile faltered when Major Talbot made a coarse remark about extravagance. Lydia's suitor grew defensive when questioned too closely about his practice. Even the servants, bringing dish after dish. Moved with attention, Miss Marple's sharp eyes did not miss. Course followed course. Steaming soup, tender pheasant, roasted goose with chestnut stuffing. Laughter rose, wine flowed, and yet beneath it all there was a sense of something unspoken, a brittle edge to the gaiety. Miss Marple, nibbling delicately, listened more than she spoke, filing away small details. She saw the way Mrs. Finch avoided the Colonel's gaze. She heard Lydia's sigh when her aunt praised another young woman's accomplishments. She noted the way Mr. Price's hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass. At last, with theatrical flourish, the centerpiece arrived, the plum pudding. It was borne in by a footman, wreathed in holly, blazing with brandy, the blue flames dancing in the dimmed light. Gasps of admiration filled the room, followed by applause. Mrs. Harwood accepted the tribute with gracious composure, though her eyes gleamed with pride. Family recipe, she declared, guarded 4 generations. The pudding was sliced and served, each guest receiving a generous portion, rich, fragrant, studded with fruit and spice. It was indeed a triumph. The company fell into appreciative silence as spoons clinked against china. Compliments rang out. Exquisite. The best I've ever tasted. Perfection itself. Miss Marple ate slowly, savouring each bite. Yet even as she did, she felt the prickling of her instincts. Something in the room had shifted. She noticed Lydia push her portion aside after a single taste, her face pale. She saw Major Talbot devour his with gusto, while Mrs. Finch hesitated, glancing nervously at her plate. Dr. Pritchard, oddly, set down his spoon too quickly, dabbing at his mouth with a forced laugh. The laughter grew louder, almost strained, and the air seemed heavier, as though anticipation lingered unspoken. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes moving from face to face. She had attended many a Christmas feast in her long life, but never, she thought, had she seen one so bright with candlelight, so rich with food and wine, nor so darkened, beneath it all, with the shadow of unease. And it was then, as she looked upon the blazing pudding, that the thought came to her, fleeting yet certain, that this Christmas would be remembered not for festivity, but for tragedy. Chapter 2. The toast of the table candles guttered faintly as a servant drew the curtains tighter against the winter light. The dining room at Greystone settled into a mellow glow, metal and crystal answering the fire with low flickers. Colonel Harwood rose to his feet, glass in hand, expression benevolent and just a shade proprietorial. A toast, he declared, letting the hum quiet, to friendship and to Christmas. May the one sweeten the other, and may both endure. Christmas first, Major Talbot rumbled, already pink from wine. Friendship's capricious. Christmas comes whether we deserve it or not. Polite laughter circled the table. Glasses touched. Miss Marple sipped her sherry without haste, her attention not on the Colonel's words, but on the small ripples they caused. Lydia Harwood, delicate as a snowdrop in pale silk, kept her eyes on her plate. Beside her, Edwin Price set his glass down too carefully, as though the stem might shatter in his fingers. Dr. Pritchard, expansive, furnished the room with another anecdote about a miraculous Victorian cure involving mustard plasters. His wife smiled loyally and glanced at the door, watching for the servants. "Now, do, Henry," Mrs. Harwood murmured to her husband. "Let cook have her triumph." "Ah, yes," the Colonel said. The pudding, the words, spoken with cheerful bombast, were not only announcement but signal. The footman reappeared, bearing the plum pudding on a silver salver. The brandy was poured and set alight. Blue flames crept like foxfire over the dark dome. A small, sincere awe took the company. Even Major Talbot fell silent. Mrs. Harwood, seated at the head, received the dish with a queenly nod. "Family recipe," she repeated, not loudly, but firmly. "From my grandmother on my mother's side. There is no equal. It looks magnificent." Mrs. Finch offered from her small place at the table's end. Her voice was thin, yet eager. "Quite magnificent." Lydia's hands clasped and unclasped in her lap. Miss Marple noticed the girl's gaze slip toward the door again, toward the hall, where music from the wireless drifted faintly, attuned to jaunty, for the house's deeper mood. Plates were set before them. A spoonful of brandy butter shivered at each edge, melting into slow, glistening rivulets. The aroma orange peel, dark sugar, a whisper of spice rose like a remembered story. Spoons lifted. The first low sound was a collective, appreciative "ah, superb," Dr. Pritchard proclaimed after a ceremonious mouthful. "My dear Mrs. Harwood, if this were a tonic I'd prescribe it. Coming from you, Doctor. That's practically an edict." Major Talbot chuckled, already attacking his portion. "Best obey at once." Miss Marple tasted. It was very good indeed, substantial, but not sodden, a lively chew of fruit and peel punctuating each bite. She found herself thinking, as she so often did, of the hands that had made it. A recipe claimed is not always a recipe executed. Had the cook been left in peace, or had an anxious mistress hovered with instructions, Mrs. Harwood wore the satisfaction of a general whose tactics had gone unchallenged. Across the table, Edwin Price murmured something to Lydia. The girl shook her head, pressing the spoon to the pudding without taking more. "I shouldn't," she attempted brightly, catching Miss Marple's eye. "I'll spoil my figure before the new year begins." "Young things never spoil," Major Talbot said with a wink. "They merely improve." Mrs. Harwood's smile thinned. "Major," she said, easy as silk, "do allow Lydia to choose for herself." A shadow crossed the young man's face. Injury or calculation? Miss Marple could not tell. Mr. Price cleared his throat. "I, for one, shall choose to obey the doctor," he said lightly, and took a small, neat mouthful. Mrs. Finch steeled herself, raised her spoon, and tasted as though the room watched, which, in some small way, it did. Relief warmed her expression. "It's really lovely," she said, and her gratitude to the pudding, to Mrs. Harwood, to the whole notion of belonging at a table made her look almost pretty. A little clink of china drew Miss Marple's attention leftward. Dr. Pritchard had set down his spoon very abruptly. He dabbed at his lips with his napkin, laughing more than the jest required at something Major Talbot had muttered. The doctor's wife touched his sleeve. "Are you quite, he declared, with a joviality that landed just short of convincing. He pushed his plate an inch away, then seemed to think better of it and drew it back. It was an unimportant movement, or would have been, if Miss Marple had not made a lifelong habit of attending to unimportant movements. "Well," the Colonel said, surveying the table with an air of benediction, "a success all round. My dear, you must tell Cook that her place in our household is secured for another year." "I shall tell Cook," Mrs. Harwood replied, lifting her glass. That discipline, accuracy, and respect for instruction and what keep a household and a recipe properly in line. Spoken like a brigadier. Major Talbot laughed. "And yet," Lydia murmured, "to low foremost and just loud enough for Miss Marple. Sometimes instructions choke what they touch." "What was that, my dear?" Mrs. Harwood's tone was dangerously pleasant. "Only that the holly looks lovely," Lydia returned, cheeks brightening. Conversation forked into smaller streams. The doctor talked hunting with the Colonel. Major Talbot warred for anecdotal supremacy with himself. Mrs. Finch, released into cautious contentment, asked Miss Marple whether the vicar still kept bees. "He used to keep them near the south wall. I remember the hum. The bees are quite themselves," Miss Marple said. "I sometimes think villages are held together by such small persisting sounds." "Held together." Mrs. Finch smiled at the phrase, then lowered her eyes. "Yes, perhaps." The footman moved with discreet efficiency, offering second helpings. Miss Marple declined. Mr. Price shook his head. Lydia's hand hovered, then withdrew. Major Talbot accepted with enthusiasm. The doctor laid his palm over his plate, as though to shield it from further charity. At the far end, near the sideboard, a maid stood with a small jug of brandy sauce, eyes lowered in proper invisibility. When she moved to refill, her sleeve brushed the Colonel's glass. A droplet trembled on the rim. Miss Marple saw it fall, saw the maid flinch, saw Mrs. Harwood's mouth compress. Austere and final, careful, Mrs. Harwood said without heat. "We serve, Eliza. We do not splash." "Begging your pardon, madam," the girl curtsied. Her hands were steady. Miss Marple noticed very steady for someone rebuked. Interesting. The wireless in the hall shifted to acquire clear young voices lifting a carol. Of course, Mrs. Pritchard said. This was the hymn at our wedding. Wasn't it, Harold? Was it? Dr. Pritchard chuckled, then coughed. A quick, harsh bark that snatched his shoulders forward. Good Lord, a crumb the wrong way. It happens to the best of us, Major Talbot assured him. I once saw a man choke to death on a fishbone, mind you, Talbot, the Colonel inserted, geniality wobbling. Not at table. Miss Marple's spoon rested, untouched. A moment longer. A draught wandered the room, nothing unusual in an old house, and yet she felt that tickle along the skin, which is not cold, but warning. Not fear, Miss Marple never indulged in that, but a small alertness. Like a sparrow cocking its head at a cat across the hedge. Miss Marple, Mrs. Finch ventured. You must tell me, how do you make your mincemeat so light? Mine is worthy. I suspect yours is merely honest, Miss Marple said. Mine cheats with a little grey-red apple and a squeeze of lemon near the end. People think it's spice when it's really frugality. Mrs. Finch's laugh true. Surprise took a thread of tension out of the air. For a moment the room relaxed, shoulders and smiles settling as if on pillows. The fire popped. The choir finished. A footman refreshed the wine. Another toast, Colonel Harwood declared, buoyed by his own success. To my wife whose pudding has conquered us all. Glasses rose obediently. Miss Marple lifted hers too, though she glanced not at Mrs. Harwood, but at the faces reflecting her. The doctor, pallor lightly dusting his cheeks. Lydia, concentrating fiercely on not looking at Mr. Price. Mr. Price, counting his breaths. Mrs. Finch, trying to appear equal to the moment and exceeding it by sincerity. Major Talbot, glowing like a coal, and twice as careless. To Mrs. Harwood, the room chorused. To Mrs. Harwood, Miss Marple echoed gently, and thought as one does when something is about to happen, and one cannot yet see its shape that triumphs. Like puddings, are safest when cooled, portioned, and shared. A thing held too close will scald. The moment burst into chatter again. Cutlery chimed, chairs shifted. Somewhere, faintly, a bell sounded from within the house, a service clock, perhaps, or the front door. Miss Marple could not tell which, but she noticed that Mrs. Harwood heard it, too, and in the little pause of listening the mistress's face hardened, not with fear, but with annoyance. An interruption at the wrong time can mar a set piece. Then the maid slipped to the Colonel's side, bending to his ear with quiet urgency. The Colonel's jovial mouth slackened. He glanced at his wife. A moment, he said, with a clumsy attempt at ease, and pushed back his chair. Is anything the matter? Mrs. Harwood asked, as if daring the world to say yes. Nothing at all, the Colonel answered too quickly. An envelope arrived, someone at the door, clerical nonsense. Do excuse me, he left. Silence trailed behind him for 3 seconds. Conversation resumed as though punching through ice. Mrs. Harwood's hand lay perfectly still beside her glass. Miss Marple, who had lived too long to believe in coincidences at feasts, thought, a letter that cannot wait, a maid with steady hands, a doctor who will not eat, a niece who will not smile. It was not a pattern yet, only threads, tangling. Miss Marple, Major Talbot demanded, tell us, is it your view that a gentleman may begin sherry before 11 if it is Christmas Day? I should think, Miss Marple said, smiling, that a gentleman does not require the calendar's permission to be kind or foolish. But he often prefers it, the Major roared. The doctor smiled, and then did not. Mrs. Finch's spoon clicked against her plate. A nervous telegraph. The choir in the hall began another carol, something plaintive, about comfort and joy. Odd, Miss Marple thought, how the words arrive early, as though to fortify. She folded her napkin, an old habit of order amid disorder, and listened to the house draw a slow breath. When the Colonel returned, a minute later, his expression was meant to be unchanged. It was not. He took his seat. The room awaited the cue to relax. All in hand, he said. All perfectly in hand. Splendid, Mrs. Harwood replied, letting the syllables ring. She signalled for the plates to be cleared. Coffee in the drawing room. As the company rose, Miss Marple's eyes slid to the pudding dish, half diminished, flame long gone, holly a little wilted at the edges. Festivities move forward, relics remain, somewhere in that cold, dark mound, hidden among raisins and peel and sugar. Something had shifted the day by a fraction. She could not yet name it. She only recognized, as she stepped from the glow of the dining room into the corridor's cooler hush, that the echo of the Colonel's words, in hand, was precisely the sort of reassurance one offers when one has very little in hand at all. Chapter 3. A sudden collapseth. Drawing room had been made to look like a picture postcard holly, threaded along the mantel, paper angels flying among the sconces, the great tree breathing resin and candle wax in the corner. A gramophone, patient and shining, waited on its table for someone to give it a reason to sing. Coffee arrived on a wheeled tray, neat and piping, flanked by a regiment of tiny cups, a silver sugar bowl, and a cream jug so polished it held a miniature party in its curved sides. Mrs. Harwood presided like a conductor. "Coffee for the gentlemen," she said, "and perhaps the ladies will allow me to tempt them as well. There are Maren's glaces, splendid." Major Talbot boomed, shoulders straining his dinner coat. The only way to finish a campaign coffee, and a sweet surrender. Dr. Pritchard took a cup, his hand steady by force of will. His wife hovered near him, as if ready to absorb any misfortune. Lydia, still pale, declined coffee and stood near the fire, warming her fingers and watching Edwin Price watch her. Mrs. Finch perched on the edge of a small chair, as though she expected to be asked to vacate it at any moment, then startled with gratitude when Miss Marple settled beside her. "Such comforts," Mrs. Finch whispered. "It's all like a magazine." "A magazine," Miss Marple said, "does not usually have draft." It was a short, chastening cough, the sort that excuses itself, but it carried a rough edge that made heads turn. "Confounded crumb," the Major managed, thumping his chest with the open palm of a man who has always trusted his body to obey. "Steady on," the Colonel said. "Have some water?" A footman moved, quick and quiet, with a glass. The Major waved it off, coughed again, tried to laugh, and coughed a third time. The sound rasped, lost its humour. His eyes, muddy with comfort a moment ago, sharpened with a sudden, bewildered alarm. "Harold," Mrs. Pritchard whispered, not to him, to her husband, the raw syllable a plea disguised as a name. Dr. Pritchard was already on his feet, his joviality falling away like a theatre cloak. "Major," he said, voice crisp, "sit forward." "No, forward, chin down." He took the Major's wrist, searched for a pulse, moved to the throat, peered at the eyes. "Are you short of breath?" "Pain in the chest, radiating, burns," the Major grated. Mouth tongue hell's own. He went to rise, failed, clawed at the armrest, and in that miscalculated movement tipped himself toward the rug. There is a sort of hush that takes a room when something unnatural declares itself. It fell now, swift and heavy. Mrs. Finch made a small cry. Lydia reached instinctively for Mr. Price's hand and did not notice that she had taken it. The Colonel stood as if his bones had been suddenly replaced with rods. "Clear the room," Dr. Pritchard said, not loudly, but the tone permitted no argument. "Air and silence." "Air," Mrs. Harwood repeated, as if translating, and moved to the window. Eliza was there first, swift hands lifting the latch, the pane drawing in cold that shocked the waltz to tatters. The smell of winter edged through the scent of pine and polish. Under it, for an instant, Miss Marple thought she caught another odour, something sharp and oddly sweet. The memory of a bitter kernel crushed. It was fleeting, uncertain. Perhaps it came from somewhere in memory other than the room. She tucked the thought away, the way a seamstress tucks a needle. "Water," Dr. Pritchard said. The footman brought it. The Major gagged, choked, turned his head away. Dr. Pritchard touched the man's jaw, looked again at the eyes, the tongue. Miss Marple saw the doctor's face change an inward darkening, a grimness that accepted something he did not want. "Harold?" Mrs. Pritchard asked, voice very small, quiet. Dr. Pritchard said. He slipped his hand to the Major's chest, counted, and shook his head once, very slightly. "Talbot," he urged, "can you hear me? Focus on my voice." For a moment the Major did eyes locking like a soldier awaiting an order. Then they unfocused, slid, and the heavy body slumped a little further toward the rug. Dr. Pritchard bent to his ear, listening, as if sound could be persuaded back. Miss Marple rose, not to interfere, never that. Not when a good man was doing what he could but to see. Seeing is an art, and most people crowd it. She stood quietly at an angle, watching not only the Major and the doctor, but the others, the maid's hands, the Colonel's jaw, Mrs. Harwood's eyes, Lydia's grip on Mr. Price's sleeve tightening until the cloth bruised. "Send for the police," Dr. Pritchard said at last. Softly, not to Mrs. Pritchard, not to Miss Marple, but to the room. "And for an ambulance, though." His wife emitted a sound that was neither question nor cry. Mrs. Finch began to pray in a whisper that was all apologies. "The police," Colonel Harwood repeated, as if the word were in a foreign tongue. "Surely, Harold, surely this is. A man does not die." Dr. Pritchard stopped himself with a professional bite to the syllables. "Colonel, please." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the coffee tray. The cups made a fine regiment, their rims stained in slight crescents where mouths had met porcelain. The sugar bowl's lid sat ajar, as if surprised. The cream turned a lazy satin loop inside its jug. The Major's empty cup on. Then another stood abandoned, saucers askew. The second spoon lying like a spent instrument on a battlefield. "Eliza," Mrs. Harwood said, composed by will alone, "go to the telephone. Inspector Dale, in Much Benham. Say there's been a," she faltered, then steadied, "a sudden death at Greystone." Eliza hesitated only to look at her mistress. Permission sought. Permission granted, then went. The door closing behind her with a polite click that sounded indecently calm. Lydia found her voice. "It was the pudding," she said, too quickly, as though words once spoken could be made unspoken by speed. "It must have been Major Talbot ate more than anyone he always does." "No," Mr. Price said, surprising them by the firmness of his tone. "No guesses." He glanced at Miss Marple then, almost as if he expected agreement or rebuke. "Guesses are seeds," Miss Marple said mildly. "They grow into thickets and hide the path." Mrs. Harwood turned, sudden and bright, upon Dr. Pritchard. "You said send for the police. Harold, why? What do you think?" "I think," Dr. Pritchard replied, each word carefully placed, "that the Major's symptoms were violent and swift. There was a burning in the mouth and throat, difficulty breathing, an odor, perhaps, though that may be my imagination. I will not name anything until I must, but I will not have the truth muddied. We will preserve the room as it is." No one touched the tray. Mrs. Pritchard put a hand to her mouth. "Oh, Harold." The Colonel's face, which had been a landscape of shock, hardened into something else, a plan, perhaps, or a bunker. "No one leaves," he said, "until Inspector Dale has come and gone. On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently, "someone must go to the servants' hall and ensure no one brings anything in or takes anything out. Doors have such bad habits of being helpful." The Colonel blinked, then nodded. Yes, of course. I'll see to it." Mrs. Finch began to tremble. Miss Marple laid a light hand on her arm. "Breathe, my dear. It is a difficult thing, but you are doing very well." "It's wicked," Mrs. Finch whispered. "At Christmas, wickedness," Miss Marple said, "has always had a fondness for holy days. There is so much to hide behind." Silence reclaimed the room, no longer shocked, but listening. The gramophone, having run out of will, spun its needle in a soft, persistent hiss. The tree breathed. The winter air probed the edges of the carpet with a timid hand. "Miss Marple," Dr. Pritchard said after a moment, not looking up, "you notice things. You always have." "If you saw anything I did not, I saw a good many small things," Miss Marple answered, "but they are not yet a picture. The puzzle has pieces on the floor, and blood on the box lid," Mr. Price muttered, and Lydia shivered. Mrs. Harwood lifted her chin. "This house will not become a circus," she said. "We will do what is proper." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Proper is a very useful word when something dreadful has happened. It gives the hands a task until the mind can bear its work. From the hall came the faint clatter of the telephone being lifted, a voice, the practiced civility of a distant exchange. Outside, unseen, church bells stumbled into the afternoon, bravely calling the hour as if the day had not altered its face. Miss Marple looked once more at the tray cups. Sugar, cream, the line where silver meets reflection, and then at the people around her, each locked already into the small prison built by fear and memory. Somewhere, between the kitchen and the table, between a letter at the door and a cough by the fire, between pride and hunger, something had been planned and carried, simple as a spoon, final as a flame dot. She did not yet know whose hand had steadied to do it, but she knew that, before the lamps were lit, the house would fill with questions, and only very small answers would tell the truth. Chapter 4. Whispers in the drawing-room. Inspection arrived first in the form of silence. The company settled into it like reluctant guests in hard chairs. The gramophone had been hushed. The tree's candles hissed faintly, little more flames feeding on wick. Outside, a wind dragged its sleeve along the windows, and the house seemed to draw closer around its inhabitants, as if listening through its own walls. Mrs. Harwood took command by standing very straight. "We shall wait in here," she said, indicating the drawing-room with a graciousness that had become metallic. "The police will come presently. No one is to go wandering." Colonel Harwood, who had gone to still the servants' hall, returned and remained by the door like a sentry. The footman stood at the far end with the coffee tray, marooned behind a cordon of attention. Eliza, the maid, kept her gaze on the carpet. Dr. Pritchard, after covering Major Talbot with a rug and arranging him as respectfully as the circumstance allowed, washed his hands in the corner basin. His motions clinical and brief. Miss Marple selected a small chair near the hearth, close enough to see faces, far enough to see the whole, and folded her hands in her lap. She had learned over the years that the first minutes after calamity were like snowfall. Details landed lightly and vanished, if not gathered. Lydia broke first. "It must have been the pudding," she whispered, as if the syllables might escape. "He ate so much." "Lydia," Mrs. Harwood said, not unkindly, but with a dorsal fin. "We do not proclaim theories. But why?" Lydia's voice had the high, thin wire of a violin string pulled too tight. "Why would anyone at Christmas to do something wicked?" Mrs. Finch murmured, clasping and unclasping her hands. "One needs a day that looks the other way." Edwin Price put himself between Lydia and the room. "Enough," he said quietly, "until the inspector arrives. We will not improve matters by frightening one another." "Mr. Price speaks sense," Dr. Pritchard said, then turned to the colonel. "You did right to keep the servants from clearing. I'd also be obliged if no one smoked. There is SM. The two nearest the armchair," Mrs. Harwood said, already pointing. "He asked for another. He always—" She stopped, something like grief or dislike flickering and quite gone. "Eliza." "Yes, madam." The maid's voice was well-bred fear. "You poured." "Eliza." Dale asked. "I carried." "Sir." Mr. James poured from the pot. She indicated the footman, who turned the shade paler that separates marble from milk. "I poured." James confirmed. "For the gentleman what asked." He swallowed. "Major Talbot twice." "Sugar." Dale said. "No sugar," James said. "He made a joke about not sweetening what's already sweet." "Cream." "A drop," James said. "First cup, not the second." Dale's pencil paused. "And the others." There was a rustle as each remembered their own cup. Mr. Price, black coffee, barely touched. Dr. Pritchard, black. The colonel, black and left alone. Mrs. Pritchard, none. Lydia, none. Mrs. Finch, cream and sugar, and a face now ash-white at the thought. Mrs. Harwood, black. Miss Marple, none. "Good," Dale said. And the pencil moved again. "We'll have the cups and the pot and the sugar and the cream taken to the station presently. But for now, they stay exactly as they are." Miss Marple watched him work with mild approval. He was not clever for cleverness' sake. He was persistent, which is the more valuable virtue. "Now," Dale said. "The pudding." Mrs. Harwood led them to the sideboard where the dark, cooling hemisphere sat veiled by its own steamless dignity. A sprig of holly had fallen sideways, as if discouraged. Dale leaned in with care. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, in her gentle village voice that had disarmed more than one bully and more than one fool. "Forgive an old woman, but might I suggest that if harm was intended to a specific person, the pudding is a noisy method. Coffee is quieter." Dale glanced at her, surprised into a half-smile. "I know you, Miss Marple. The vicar speaks well of your eyes, but I've learned not to accept one path only. We'll look at both." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. "Please." Mrs. Harwood cleared her throat. "My cook Mrs. Mack has made that pudding for 3 years running under my direction. It is my grandmother's recipe, and I keep the key to the pantry where the fruit and brandy are stored. Who else has access?" Dale asked. "No one," Mrs. Harwood said, and in that single syllable lived a whole biography. Eliza's lashes flickered once. James stared at the tray as if hoping to be absorbed by it. "Mrs. Mack was in the kitchen all morning." Dale went on. "Of course," Mrs. Harwood said. "There is a dinner to be produced. She has a maid, Nora, and the scullery boy. Eliza assists where needed." Dale made his mark. "I'll want to see them. And the kitchen." He left the room with Colonel Harwood, Dr. Pritchard, and James. The door closed on their competence. What remained in the drawing-room was the silt, anxious women, a frightened maid, a young couple bound by a newly public handclasp, and an elderly gentlewoman who preferred yarn to melodrama, and nevertheless found herself babysitting catastrophe. "Miss Marple," Lydia said suddenly. The words pressed flat, so they would not shake. "If it was the coffee, then it was after the pudding. That means," she swallowed, "that means it wasn't someone hiding a thing inside the pudding, does it?" "It means," Miss Marple said, "that whatever was done in a smaller theatre, that can make actors braver." Mrs. Finch shivered. "Who would be brave in such a way?" "People are brave in very contradictory ways," Miss Marple said. "A mother for a child, a clerk for a coin, a proud woman for a reputation, a certain sort of man for a certainty." "Eliza," Mrs. Harwood said sharply, "stop fidgeting." Eliza, who had not moved, stiffened. "Yes, madam." Miss Marple regarded the girl. "Steady hands, earlier. Steady now." But a new shallow in the breath. Fear, not guilt. Fear notices the door. Guilt listens to the tray. Eliza's eyes ticked, not to the tray, but to Lydia. Curious. Double quotes Mrs. Harwood. Mrs. Pritchard said in a voice that begged to be dismissed kindly. "If one were to, might I sit somewhere not here?" "You may go to the morning room," Mrs. Harwood allowed, "but do not wander." Miss Marple finished, smiling, an old woman's feint at mischief that lifted the steel by a hair. "We shall not wander." When Dale returned, his face was graver and more certain. "We'll have a constable at the back and one at the front," he said. "The kitchen is as in order as kitchens are. Mrs. Mack is staunch as a lighthouse and just as offended. The coffee pot smells of nothing at all. The cream has no odor. The sugar is sugar. The cups will tell us more than our noses. Doctor, I'll require your certificate in due course, but for now I'd ask that the body not be moved." Dr. Pritchard inclined his head. "Of course." Dale looked around the room as a miller looks at grain, measuring not the shape of each kernel, but the pattern of the heap. "I'll take brief notes now and fuller statements later." "Miss Harwood." "Lydia, isn't it?" "You first, if you please." Lydia stood, her dignity buckling only in the hands. "Yes," she said. She crossed to the inspector. As she passed Miss Marple, the older woman saw a small line of sugar like frost on the cuff of Lydia's silk sleeve, a stroke that would have shaken off with a thought, had the wearer been thinking. Miss Marple's eyes followed the line to Mr. Price's coat, where a pale dust, quickly brushed, left a ghost at the seam. Sugar is innocence's costume. It sticks to the tidy and the guilty alike. Whispers are beginning, Miss Marple thought, as Dale's pencil prepared itself for more. Better to give them sentences before they become a mob. And so, while the house bent under the first weight of shock, Miss Marple quietly began to thread together a drawing room's worth of small, Stubborn truths. Who drank, who didn't, who watched doors, who rehearsed composure and who performed it, who smelled of almond and who only knew the word. The puzzle was still a table of scattered pieces, but from her little chair she saw the border forming, and in the corner of that border, like a miniature winter scene, stood a sugar bowl, a steady maid, and a girl with frost on her cuff, outside. The wind pressed a palm to the window and, finding no entry, passed on. Inside, the inspector asked his questions, and the whispers tried successfully to learn how to lie like facts. Chapter 5. Secrets beneath the surface. Inspector Dale established a small province at the escritoire, notebook, blotter, a clock that clicked with self-importance. One by one he drew people across the carpet, as if hauling in nets. The room, parted by a wide silence, watched the catch. He began with Lydia. She sat very straight, pale as a snowdrop that had not chosen its season. "I had no coffee," she said. "I dislike it." I stood by the fire. I ate a little of the pudding and stopped. I felt, not unwell, but as if the room were too close. "Did the Major speak to you? At table or after?" Dale asked. At table he was jovial. In the drawing room he winked at me. Her mouth hardened a little. He was fond of winks. "Any quarrel between you?" Lydia's glance slipped, almost gratefully, to Miss Marple, who answered nothing and gave back only stillness. "I had no quarrel," Lydia said. "Major Talbot had opinions about my future." "What sort of opinions?" "That it ought to be arranged," Lydia said. And the steel within the silk made its first sound. Dale nodded and let her go. Edwin Price followed, tidy to the edge of brittle, the knot of his tie pleading to remain exact. "You were Miss Harwood's suitor," Dale said. Double quotes. "Yes," Mr. Price replied. "With Colonel and Mrs. Harwood's consent pending. I am a solicitor with Marshall and Kitson, in Much Benham." "You had coffee?" "A mouthful only," Price said. "Black?" Then I set it down. "Why?" "Because the room felt like a stage. I thought better of anything that might be a prop." Dale considered him. "Did you know Major Talbot well? Enough to dislike him?" Mr. Price said without embroidery. "He confuses cheerfulness with character. Quarrel. A professional difference," Mr. Price said. "But it can wait." "Nothing will wait," Dale said evenly. Mr. Price glanced at Lydia, then at the Colonel, then unexpectedly at Miss Marple. "Major Talbot was one of the trustees of Miss Harwood's late father's estate. I have been reviewing papers at the family's request." He drew a breath. "There are irregularities. We had not confronted him formally. I sent the Colonel advance notice this morning that a fuller accounting would be required." "The envelope," Miss Marple murmured. Price nodded once. "A messenger brought it. It was not intended as a scene." "Did the Major know?" Dale asked. "I can't say," Price replied. "But people often know when they are about to be asked for the truth. It alters their cheerfulness." Dale made marks that were not in the notebook. "Thank you, Mr. Price." Mrs. Finch came next, twisting a handkerchief to a piece of lace. "I had cream and sugar," she said at once, as if reciting her sins. "I never know what to do with black coffee. I'm sorry. It seems foolish now." "It seems ordinary," Dale said. "Which is the point." Mrs. Finch's eyes filled. They were pretty when they were not arguing with hunger. "I knew the Major years ago. Not well. My sister was in service near his posting. There were dances. He was lively. When my sister went away to a cousin, she wrote less. Then not at all. She died. It was a fever. But I have never." She bit the rest in two. "I'm not saying anything about the Major," she finished, suddenly prim. "You already have," Dale said, not unkindly. "Thank you." Dr. and Mrs. Pritchard offered less romance and more fact. "He went fast," the doctor said. "I will not put my name to a cause until the analysis returns. But if you force me to a suspicion, yes, cyanide, the bitter almond, the burning, the speed, from the coffee." Dale asked. "From something taken at that time," Dr. Pritchard answered. "Coffee is the simplest carriage. Could he have carried it himself?" Miss Marple asked softly. Dr. Pritchard's eyes flickered. He was not a man to love a puzzle, but he respected it. "Suicide," "I do not think so." The man's expression was surprise and anger, not intention. The servants came as a set, James, tall and pallid, remembering each cup, if it had become a life raft. Eliza, steady as rope. Mrs. Mac, the cook, sail-bellied and outraged at the world's capacity to misunderstand pudding. Dale took down their statements, measured their breath. He asked where the sugar had sat at each moment, and whether anyone had approached the tray who was not served. "People wonder," James said miserably. "They look at the tree, sir, and they take a sweet, sometimes, though the sweets ain't for taking yet, and they set down their cup and pick it up again without proper mind to saucers. Did anyone add sugar for the Major?" Dale asked. "No, sir," James replied with wretched certainty. "He took no sugar first time. When I brought the second cup, he took it straight off the saucer, like a man impatient for reinforcements." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the sugar bowl, a pretty glass with a lid, a small spoon resting companionably in its mouth. Beside it lay the tongs, 4 lumps, the silver scissoring like a bird's beak. A fine dusting of sugar lay on the tray, as sugar always lays, scriptures of innocence. On the padded palm of the tongs, where the lump sits, a faint discoloration, no more than the notion of a stain, caught her eye. "Inspector," she said, when Eliza had finished, "it might be well to wrap those tongs." "We'll wrap everything," Dale said. But he did so with the tongs first, which earned him a small nod from Miss Marple, and an unearned reputation for second sight when, much later, people retold the story, when the round of statements was done. The drawing-room seemed tired of its own furniture. Mrs. Harwood stood at the mantel like a figurehead cut for a harsher sea. The Colonel had taken to polishing his spectacles with a corner of his handkerchief, an action that returned them to his nose no cleaner, and his situation no clearer. "You wish to ask me, Inspector," Mrs. Harwood said crisply, "about our connection with Major Talbot." "I wish to ask you many things," Dale said, matching Christmas with cloth. "Begin where you like." "He was an old acquaintance of my husband's," she said. "After the war he had few anchors. We extended civility. He took it for welcome and drank it as entitlement. He was not a good influence. And as trustee, I argued against his appointment," she said, and the sentence had all the pleasure of a remembered victory. "But Lydia's father, my brother, would have it so. The Major was a friend. Men are fond of men who make them merry." She paused. "I do not believe Major Talbot meant harm to Lydia's estate, but I am not convinced he would have recognized harm if it wore his favorite waistcoat." The Colonel cleared his throat. "The letter Mr. Price sent," he admitted, "concerned questions about investments the Major had supported. There were losses, not ruinous until they became so in arithmetic. Miss Lydia's coming of age makes matters brisk." His jaw moved once, as though remembering the messenger's knock. "I stepped out to keep the scene inside." Chapter 6. The cook's confession. The kitchen of Greystone Manor was as far from the glittering drawing-room as one could travel without leaving the house. Stone-flagged floors, walls scented with spice and steam, copper pans gleaming like medals, all under the sovereignty of Mrs. Macdot. She was a formidable woman, broad-shouldered, flower-dusted, and red-cheeked, with the air of one who brooked neither nonsense nor shortcuts. At her table sat a vast mixing bowl still sticky with batter. On the dresser, mince pies cooling like obedient children. Her arms were folded, her chin lifted, and her eyes sparked with injured pride. Inspector Dale stood before her, notebook ready. Miss Marple, small and neat beside him, seemed no more than a guest in the great lady's domain. Yet Mrs. Mac's gaze settled not on Dale, but on Miss Marple, as if recognizing in the old woman a fellow judge of households. "You'll be asking about the pudding," Mrs. Mac said, before Dale could begin. "We will," Dale confirmed. "Who prepared it?" "I did," Mrs. Mac declared. "Every currant, every peel, every stir. My own hands. No one else touches my puddings. No one at all," Dale pressed. "I've my scullery boy, of course, Starmy. He scrubs basins and washes suet, but he doesn't mix. Nora peels apples, chops peel, runs for this and that. But when it comes to the pudding, my pudding none. But me stirs the bowl or lights the brandy." Miss Marple's smile was kind. That must be a great responsibility. Mrs. Mac, everyone in the village has spoken of your puddings. Mrs. Mac's expression softened by a hair. There's pride in it. A pudding's the crown of Christmas. People don't see the patience. You can't rush fruit, miss. Soak it too little. You've got stones. Stir it too long. You've got glue. It's the balance that matters. Inspector Dale tapped his pencil. When was it made? Last month, Mrs. Mac replied. Proper puddings need to sit. I keep 'em wrapped in muslin in the pantry. Cool, dry, dark. This one's been basted with brandy every Sunday, since Stir-Up Sunday. And the pantry is locked. Dale asked. Mrs. Mac's chest swelled. Locked with the key on my ring. She drew out a stout chain that clinked like armor. No one gets in but me. Madam herself asks before she steps inside. Miss Marple tilted her head. But someone might ask you for a taste. A sweet tooth in the household, perhaps. Mrs. Mac sniffed. Not of the puddings. A spoonful of mincemeat. A biscuit filched that I'll allow. But the pudding is sacred. And yet, Dale said, one of your guests died after eating it. The word struck like a ladle against a copper pot. Mrs. Mac flushed, fists tightening. Not from my pudding. I'll swear it before the vicar, the judge, and the Lord himself. Major Talbot ate my pudding last year, and lived to grumble another 12 months. If he's dead now, it's not because of me. Miss Marple's voice was soft. The way one coaxes a nervous bird. Perhaps not because of you, Mrs. Mac, but could someone have tampered with it after you brought it to the kitchen today? Mrs. Mac frowned. It went from pantry to steamer this morning. Boiled 6 hours, wrapped tight. I fetched it out, trimmed it, poured the brandy, and lit it. The footman carried it straight to table. No one slipped a hand in between. Eliza, standing nearby, cleared her throat. I laid the holly sprigs, madam, at your order. True, Mrs. Mac admitted. Eliza set them in. But holly's no poison. And she was watched. Still, Miss Marple said, there is a curious thing. Major Talbot was the heartiest eater, and the first to fall, but not the only one to taste. Dale looked thoughtful. So if it were the pudding, others would have been stricken. Exactly, Mrs. Mac said fiercely. And none were. Miss Marple considered. Which makes one think of portioning. Did anyone receive a slice from a different section? One cut away while others still waited. Mrs. Mac's brow furrowed as she searched her memory. The slices were even. I pride myself on it. But yes, the Major's was the first served. From the crown of the pudding, where the holly sat. He joked about it. Said he had the king's share. Dale scribbled. The holly. Or something beneath it. Double quotes. Mrs. Mac bristled. Are you saying Guy? No one is saying that. Miss Marple interrupted. And yet, Miss Marple said pleasantly, bottles have a way of growing legs. Dale turned to James when he was fetched. The footman's face had learned the pallor of officialdom. Sir, I swear no bottle. Not from here. Sergeant, Dale said to his man. A quick look in the butler's pantry and the decanter cupboard. If it turns up, I want to know how it walked. The sergeant vanished. Cook, Miss Marple asked, was the bottle full yesterday? No, Mrs. Mac said. I measure. It was low, as I said. Not worth a gentleman's bother. Not unless a gentleman were in a hurry. Dale's pencil hesitated above the page, and did not quite touch it down. A missing bottle could mean nothing more than thrift, he said. Or it could mean someone required a container that could be convincingly empty, to take away, Miss Marple suggested, or to decant into something more sociable. Dale nodded once. We'll keep our eyes open. The sergeant reappeared with the efficiency of a bad omen. Sir, the decanter cupboard's as it should be, but in the morning room great. We'll see it, Dale said. And they went. The morning room had the polite chill of a place designed to keep emotions from settling. Lace curtains, watercolors of distant lakes, a gas fire that flattered itself. Upon the great lay a scatter of grey that had not yet learned to be ash. The sergeant, with the tender brutality of his calling, had already teased from it several charred curls of paper and laid them on a newspaper. Late fire, Dale observed. Not an hour old. The curls were stubborn in their secrecy, ink ghosting to edges, middles fallen away. Miss Marple put on the spectacles she kept for mending, and peered with the sober intimacy of a woman who had read far more than anyone expected. "Here," she said, touching with a knitting needle the sergeant had providently fetched. A figure, a 5, and before it, a pound sign. No, not a pound. A letter S with a small tailor. No dollars. She raised her brows. "That is not our usual coin here." Dale's mouth compressed. "And this, you steeze to forbear. The first letters are gone." He lifted another fragment. "Until Miss H. of age." He glanced up. Mr. Price spoke of trustees and of Lydia's coming of age, and of irregularities. Miss Marple added, "A letter that burned just when a death required kindling. Convenient paper, Inspector." Dale did not smile. "Or very inconvenient, depending on whose hands are singed." He looked round the small room. The window latch had a smut of ash on it. On the mantel stood a clock pretending never to have seen a crime. The coal scuttle was not quite where its square of carpet remembered it. "Who uses this room?" he asked. "Mrs. Harwood," Eliza replied softly from the door. "For small business that doesn't deserve the study. And Miss Lydia for her letters if Madam inspects the post. Miss writes drafts here." "Ah," Miss Marple breathed. "Drafts are such honest things until courage catches up with them." Dale crouched and touched the irons. "Warm. We'll bag what we can." "Sergeant, the ash and the fragments." They returned to the passage. There, the house's own gossip drafts through old keyholes. A grandfather clock boasting its seconds seemed noisier than people. Miss Marple looked thoughtful, as if counting stitches. "Inspector," she said at length, "there is a temptation in the presence of ash to imagine that only the past lies in it. But ash also tells one what someone wished to put in the past before its time." "Indeed," Dale said. "And brandy bottles, when they vanish, tell one that someone anticipates thirst." They were crossing the landing, toward the back stairs, when voices slipped through. The crack of the half-closed door to the small library. Dale and Miss Marple halted together, not rudely, but with the stillness of people who know a truth when it tries to flee. "You promised me." Lydia's voice trembled. "You said it would be arranged quietly." "I promised to try," Mr. Price answered, low and taut. "I cannot conjure propriety out of a ledger that has been made to dance." If he had answered letters, "You should have stopped the letters," Lydia said, desperation scalding her manners. "You should have told me nothing of it, and then there would be nothing to bear." "That is not how debt behaves," Price returned, and misery made him bitter. "It likes company." There was a small sound, a hand against a bookshelf, perhaps, or a young woman steadying herself against the future. Miss Marple moved away, gentle as a closing book. Dale waited a heartbeat longer than propriety, which is exactly long enough to make a note without making a scene. In the hall, the sergeant caught them up. "Sir, the bottle, found in the west garden shrubbery, beneath the drawing-room window. Empty. No label stripped. Cork missing." Dale took the bottle through his handkerchief. Its glass was ordinary. Its neck showed the faint abrasion of a cork drawn in haste. He stooped to smell. The sergeant twitched as if to warn him. Dale smelled anyway. Brandy, as expected. And something. No, the ghost of suggestion. Will not trust noses. Miss Marple tilted her head. A bottle thrown from the drawing-room window. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's watchful eye fell over Greystone Manor, heavy and blue against the windows. The fire burned brighter as constables came and went, their boots echoing on the stone floors, while they filled their notebooks with half-truths from weary people. Inspector Dale had stepped out to speak with his sergeant, leaving the drawing-room tense, but free of questions. Miss Marple sat quietly in her low chair by the fire. Her knitting needles moved steadily, not for progress, but to give the impression of harmless routine. An old woman knitting, after all, was the perfect disguise. No one notices her eyes as they wander. The room had already shifted. Lydia sat near the window, clutching her small reticule like a child's toy. Edwin Price sat close, pretending not to guard her. Mrs. Harwood stood tall at the mantel, tapping her fingers, while the Colonel fussed endlessly over his spectacles. Mrs. Finch, nervous and fluttering, stayed near Miss Marple, as though her age offered safety. Dr. Pritchard poured himself a small measure of brandy. while his wife scolded him silently with her eyes. Eliza, the maid, stood by the door as motionless as a piece on a chessboard. Miss Marple knitted to plain, one pearl her thoughts weaving as neatly as the wool. Small observations Leah kept, glancing at the sugar bowl, not with hunger, but with fear, as if it might accuse her. Edwin noticed and shifted his chair to block her line of sight. Protective, yes, but also anxious. Mrs. Harwood's posture was perfect, yet her tapping fingers betrayed irritation. The Colonel's polishing had turned obsessive, as if he could rub guilt away with a cloth. Mrs. Finch whispered to Miss Marple about plum pudding, ashamed of her ordinary thoughts amidst tragedy. Miss Marple reassured her. Ordinary thoughts keep us steady. A curious detail in the tray of cups and saucers lay the sugar tongs, faintly smeared with something unusual. Miss Marple suspected cyanide residue. She remembered Lydia's velvet reticule, with its hidden sugar lumps. Perhaps innocent or perhaps deadly. A test of nervesmas. Harwood suddenly addressed Miss Marple. You seem very calm. Do you suspect any of us? Miss Marple smiled mildly. Suspicion is like salt. A little is needed, but too much spoils everything. The stillness before the storm silence filled the room, heavy and electric. Lydia clutched Edwin's hand. Mrs. Finch wept quietly. The Colonel swallowed hard, while Mrs. Harwood's eyes blazed with cold fury, not at Miss Marple, but at the thought of disorder invading her home. Inspector Dale closed his notebook with a snap. Then the task is to prove who had the wit to make use of the Major's own poison. Miss Marple, I believe you've brought us to the threshold. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thresholds are very useful, Inspector. They remind one that the next step must be taken with care. The clock on the mantel chimed 11. Snow slid from the roof with a soft thud, and within the room, every breath waited for the next revelation. Chapter 10. The poisoner unmasked. Morning pushed a thin light through the curtains of Greystone Manor, turning the drawing room's gilt to pewter. Inspector Dale stood at the hearth with his notebook closed, as though the day would open it soon enough. The company had gathered once more, faces sallow with sleeplessness, voices careful on the carpet. Miss Marple sat in her small chair as before, knitting laid aside. Her hands rested together empty. Capable. Ladies and gentlemen, Dale began, we have what we need from the laboratory to add to what we saw with our eyes. A little patience, and we may cut the hedge to the truth. If we must garden, Mrs. Harwood said. Hard and fine. Let us finish. Dale nodded to Miss Marple. Madam. She rose. No theatre, only the steadiness of a village woman who had spoken in halls colder than this. Let us be simple, she said. Major Talbot was killed by cyanide carried to his lips on a spoon. The poison was not in the pot or the cream. The cups were innocent save for his. One spoon was prepared in expectation that he, impatient, jovial, careless with ceremony, would seize it. She looked around. So the murderer required two things: knowledge of the Major's habits, and a moment of undisturbed access to a single spoon. She let that rest, then continued. Last night, we busied ourselves with puddings and holly and sugar lumps. Useful hedges, perhaps, but hedges all the same. The murder was quieter. Dale unfolded a paper. The chemist confirmed cyanide on the bowl of 1 spoon and fainter on the sugar tongs. There is none on the coffee pot, none detectable in the sugar bowl or cream. There are traces on a certain handkerchief. He paused, and upon the inside of a particular gentleman's spectacles. Silence stiffened. Colonel Harwood's polishing stopped mid-stroke. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Colonel, you poured the Major's first coffee and his second. You announced a toast. You presided with your wife's authority beside you, and yet your own cup remained, as I remarked, untasted. I lost the taste for it, the Colonel said, too quickly. After the letter, after that damned interruption. Ah yes, Miss Marple said softly, the letter that told you Mr. Price had found irregularities in your late brother-in-law's estate. Irregularities for which the Major, as trustee, would be questioned and for which you, as the household's head and adviser, would be blamed at least with negligence, at most with complicity. Edwin Price flushed. I sent notice to give you time to prepare, Colonel, not to provoke. This, The Colonel's jaw worked. "I meant to speak to the Major, put it right. You stepped out," Miss Marple continued, "with that pretext of clerical nonsense. You went to the morning room. There the fire was laid fresh, ash that had not learned to be ash, fragments that spoke of trustees, and the young lady coming of age. You burned what would make a scene in your house." Dale's tone was even. "Your fingerprints, Colonel, are on the morning room poker. That may be nothing. You live here, but the brandy bottle, found in the west shrubbery, beneath this room's window, its label torn, its neck abraded, bears a thumbprint consistent with yours as well." Mrs. Harwood's head turned to her husband, not quickly, not theatrically, only the smallest correction of a ship's course. "Henry," he tried to laugh and found no air for it. "A man picks up a bottle, any bottle, on Christmas. What is that to prove? That the bottle was used as a tool, not a drink," Miss Marple answered. "A vessel in which to crush or rinse. One may crumble a tablet, damp it with brandy to make a paste, and smear a spoon, so that the bitter is masked. The chemist cannot swear to brandy's presence, it vanishes when asked, but the abrasion on the bottle's neck shows haste. The torn label shows anxiety, and the shrubbery shows fear." She stepped closer only a pace, but it brought her within the circle where people tell the truth or strike out. "Colonel, you returned from the morning room with your face arranged. You poured for the Major with a flourish. You did not drink your own. You stood by the window later, with your spectacles in your hand, and a handkerchief industriously at work. And on that handkerchief the chemist found a breath of cyanide, faint but real." The Colonel stared at her as if she had shrunk him with a spell. Then he looked at Dale, at the shut book, at the spoon on the tray. His lips formed words and abandoned them. Mrs. Harwood's voice, when it came, was iron made quiet. "Say nothing, Henry. On the contrary," Miss Marple said. "Say what must be said. You are not a natural murderer. You are an anxious man who believes in order, married to a woman who embodies it. You feared scandal, not justice. You feared that Lydia's position would be ruined, that your household would be named as fools. You meant, perhaps, to frighten the Major, to stop his mouthmen tell themselves such comfortable stories on their way to wickedness, but you chose a spoon instead of a sentence." Something broke in the Colonel's face, not resolve, exactly, but the last thread holding together the version of himself he preferred. "He was bleeding me," he said hoarsely. "Not money, reputation. He laughed at my caution. He had led investments I should have refused. And when I tried to unpick them, to put it right before Lydia came of age, he called me old woman, old hen, old. He told me he would say that I had pressed him, that my name appeared on papers only a trustee saw. He had." The Colonel swallowed. "He had letters, copies. He carried everything in his pockets like a tinker. The lozenges, the sprigs, the damning scraps. He liked the feel of power against his ribs." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Finch. She shivered, remembering dances and careless pockets. "I took the tin," the Colonel muttered. "In the morning room. He had set his coat there when we came in from dinner, careless and I." His hands opened and closed. "There were tablets in it, bitter. God help me. I knew enough to know what they could be. I thought I told myself that, if I used his poison, there would be no trail to my pantry, no blame to my wife's house. I crushed one. I painted the spoon. I set it by his cup when James turned to the sugar." His voice went thin. "I thought it needed a push. I thought it would teach him to be quiet. Cyanide does not whisper, Colonel," Dale said. Mrs. Harwood had not moved. Her face had not changed. Only her hands, which had governed a household, now rested palms down on the mantel as if to steady the house itself. "You fool," she said softly, not cruelty, only a spare truth. "If you had told me, if you had walked into disorder, I was protecting you," he whispered. "You were protecting your idea of me," she replied. And then, quieter still. "And yourself." Lydia stood, reticule forgotten. "Uncle," she said, and the word was a hurt made into a syllable. Edwin Price went to her and did not try to hold her hand. He had learned better in a single dreadful day. Inspector Dale breathed once, as a man does before pronouncing the necessary. "Colonel Henry Harwood, I must ask you to come with me to the station." "You are not to speak further without counsel. You will be charged." The colonel's shoulders sagged. Relief and ruin sometimes arrive arm in arm. He looked at Mrs. Harwood with a plea that had no words. She gave him none. He looked at Lydia and attempted a smile that remembered being an uncle. He failed. "May I?" he began, and stopped. There was nothing to fetch, nothing to arrange. He nodded once to Miss Marple. "You have a way of making a man wish he had chosen his first wrong thing more carefully." Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but did not look away. "It is not the first wrong thing that kills, Colonel. It is the one a man convinces himself is the last." Dale signalled his sergeant. The little procession moved. A gentleman, his dignity reduced to a coat. A policeman whose duty had taught him to be gentle with wrists. A house that had to swallow the sight. When the door had closed, Mrs. Finch sat abruptly and began to cry without making a sound. Mrs. Pritchard sought a cushion, as if seeking a theology. Eliza stared at the floor, understanding what loyalty costs even when it is not asked. Mrs. Harwood turned to Miss Marple. The iron was gone. Something older had taken its place, something like winter, clear and cold. "Is this," she asked, "what you call justice?" "It is what we call consequence," Miss Marple said quietly. "Justice will come later and wear a different dress." And Lydia. Mrs. Harwood looked toward the girl with an unreadable expression, part apology, part instruction, part love that could not find its familiar tools. "She will not be ruined. Not by this," Edwin Price answered, surprising himself by stepping toward the future. "We will set the estate to rights." Opally, Mrs. Harwood inclined her head once. "See that you do it without romance." Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "There is some mercy in this, harsh though it sounds. The poison came from the Major's own tin. The house did not contribute its larder to wickedness. Your cook will sleep again." A breath, almost a laugh, escaped Mrs. Harwood. "Mrs. Mack's sleep matters. Sleep," Miss Marple said, "is where small decencies begin." Dale returned a few minutes later. Businesslike. Arrangements were in motion. The day would now behave itself. He thanked Miss Marple with a formality that had no sarcasm in it. "I only did what any old woman might do," she demurred. "Most old women do not see," Dale said. "They remember." "You do both," Miss Marple smiled. "One must practice, outside." The ice brightened. A constable's boots marked the path to the gate. Within, the tree long ignored caught a scrap of sun and offered it back in a quiet glitter. Mrs. Finch dabbed her eyes. Lydia stood straighter. Mrs. Harwood rang for Eliza and said, in a voice that had real and gentleness, "Hot tea for all." As the household moved, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. To plain, one pearl. To plain, one pearl. A simple pattern that, kept faithfully, makes a whole. In her lap the wool grew under her hands. Order from thread. Warmth from patience. Christmas, she thought, has never guaranteed peace. It merely gives us candles with which to look at what we are. And sometimes, if one is very fortunate, it gives us enough light to see the way back to kindness. She looked up once more at the tray cups now cold. The guilty spoon wrapped tight. The tongs swaddled like a bad idea. A servant came to carry them away. Miss Marple nodded. Satisfied. In a village not far from here. The bees would be sleeping deep in their winter cluster, humming to keep alive what they could not yet use. In time they would wake. In time, the house would, too. For now, there was tea. And in the quiet that followed, Miss Marple permitted herself a small, private grace. She was grateful that the pudding, at least, had been innocent. Snow lingered on the eaves of Greystone long after the inspector's carriage had taken Colonel Harwood away. The house, though scarred by scandal, began to breathe again, servants moving with less fear. Lydia and Edwin speaking in low, hopeful tones. Mrs. Finch comforted by the simple blessing of hot tea. Mrs. Harwood stood silent at the window, her composure unbroken. But in her stillness Miss Marple sensed a woman counting the cost of order, kept her tightly. As for Miss Marple, she returned to St. Mary Mead the next morning, her shawl wrapped close, her knitting bag tucked neatly at her side. The village greeted her with Christmas cheer, none the wiser of the tragedy that had shadowed her holiday. She merely smiled, for she knew well that wickedness does not choose its days, it only hides among them. And so, life resumed, steady as knitting, waiting for the next pattern,